What were the things that Jesus valued? It's indicated in the things that made him mad. For example, it made him mad when insiders got in the way of outsiders, those religious referees that were always ready to throw the flag and blow the whistle on others who were trying to make their way to God. It made him mad when people valued rules over relationships. It made him mad when people valued religion over grace. And today we'll see that when people value their own guilt over the offer of God's forgiveness, no doubt it has a way of frustrating our God in heaven. How are we supposed to deal with guilt, denial, depression, and shame? That's what makes many of us uncomfortable with silence, because that silence magnifies our guilt. It magnifies our embarrassment. It magnifies our depression to the point where it can just become overwhelming to us. Jesus' first followers had to deal with their own guilt and shame just like everybody else. For example, Judas is remembered for betraying Jesus, and Peter is remembered for denying him. But yet all of the disciples abandoned him and left him to suffer and die alone on the cross. They were so overwhelmed that they spent the next several days hiding in the upper room, just wallowing in fear, in shame, and in confusion about what to do next. How do we respond to the silent screams in our head of accusations, guilt, and shame that go on inside our head and our heart? Jesus spoke about that in a parable in Luke 18, verse 9. It says, "To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable." Boy, those are fun people to be around, aren't they? Pay attention to what shaped their approach to how they were living their life. That life that was summarized by that condescending spirit within them. Because how we live our life often is determined by what we believe. It frames our life, it directs our life, and it actually affects then how we interact with others. In their world, it made sense to them based on their assumption that, hey, I'm a good guy. I'm right with God. I'm good people. I usually try to do the right thing. And they became very comfortable with the idea of standing before God and saying, I'm a good person. You've got to let me in. But yet in verse 10 of Luke 18, Jesus says this, 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. Jesus couldn't have painted a more stark contrast of 2 people than a Pharisee and a tax collector. Remember, the Pharisees were the religious rule keepers. They were the referees of all things with regard to God. They were the hall monitors of the day, if you will, and they were known for having their life all put together, or at least giving people the impression that their life was all together. But in stark contrast to that, during the time of Jesus, there was no one more despised, as respected as the Pharisees were. There was no one more despised than the tax collectors. Their nation had been invaded and overrun by Romans. They'd lost their country. And as a result of that, the Romans imposed their will, their culture, and, what a shock, their taxes on the people of Jerusalem. Imagine the resentment that you'd feel if your family, if your friend, if your neighbor sold out and went to work for them. Imagine your disgust with them if every week you had to turn over up to 80% of your income to them, knowing that the government only required 50% and you were skimming another 30% off the top for yourself. And as you struggle to keep food on your table and a roof over your head and clothes on your kids' back, you looked next door at your neighbor, or, for example, you looked at your family when you would get together, and they became more and more wealthy. Their houses became more and more opulent. their lifestyle became more and more over the top while you were struggling, and you knew the reason for that was because they had taken more than their share. And the Romans endorsed it. As long as they turned over Rome's cut, they could keep whatever they wanted to keep. And there was nothing you could do to resist it, because they'd turn you over to the authorities. In verse 11 and 12 of Luke 18, this Pharisee, the one who was convinced that he was good with God, the one who was proud of how his image with others was that this is what it looks like when you're right with God. The Pharisee stood up and he began to pray, God, I thank you that I'm not like other people. I'm not a thief or a dishonest person. I haven't committed adultery. I'm not like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and I give you 1/10 of my entire income. You've known people like that, right? They smugly compare themselves with others, and somehow they always manage to find the worst part of you to compare the best part of themselves to. That's how being a good person has to function. But not everyone feels like they've got their life together. For example, in verse 13 of Luke 18, it says, by contrast, the tax collector stood off by himself at a distance, and he wouldn't even look up to heaven as he prayed. Instead, beating himself on his chest, he simply said, God, have mercy on me. I'm a sinner. You see, in his heart of hearts, he is completely self-aware of what his life has become. He's completely aware of what others think of him. He is, of course, the most despised in his town. Nobody wants to claim a relationship with him. And he hates it. More than that, he hates himself for what he's become. The only problem is, at this point, he doesn't see any way out. And it's at this point in the story when Jesus throws a curveball that nobody sees coming. In verse 14, he says, I tell you that this man, rather than the other, this man, speaking of the tax collector, this man, speaking of the one that everybody hated, this man who hated himself and could only throw himself on the mercy of God, this man, Jesus says, is the one who went home justified before God. Not the one everyone looked up to, not the one who looked down on everyone else, but the one who understood his great need for forgiveness. Justified. It means to be declared to be righteous. Jesus goes beyond just not condemning him. He goes beyond just saying, oh, never mind, that's okay, you're not that bad. No, instead, he actually pronounces him as good. Now, hold on, Jesus. How can the bad guy in the story be the good person? Because that doesn't make sense. Especially when the good person in the story, at least the one that sees himself as a good person and the one that's recognized wisely as the good person, he's the one that's a non-starter with God. Well, the answer is quite simply this. God is not impressed when we try to impress him with how good we are. He's looking for something entirely different. And when it comes to feeling guilty as you stand before God, Jesus says what God is really looking for is humility, honesty, transparency. That kind of integrity that says, God, I know who I am. I know what I've done, and I'm not trying to impress you or pretend that it's not there, that it's not real. In Mark chapter 5, verse 1, there's another illustration of how that plays out in somebody's life. Jesus and his followers cross over the Sea of Galilee to the region of the Gerasenes. They leave the land of the insiders, Jerusalem, and all of the religious Pharisees and the rule keepers and the referees. They leave that land and instead go over to the land of the outsiders, the Gentiles. And when they pull onto shore and jump out of the boat, as soon as Jesus gets out of the boat, it says in Mark chapter 5, verse 2, immediately a man with an evil spirit comes running up to them from the burial caves. They've landed in a cemetery. Welcome to your worst Halloween nightmare, huh? Fight or flight immediately sets in a big way. And in verses 3 through 5, it describes this guy as someone who lived there in the tombs. Nobody could control him, even though they tried numerous ways, tying him up, even with chains, not just chains around his hands, but also shackles around his feet. And he'd broken free every single time. He was too strong for anyone to control him. I guess the closest comparison we would have to that kind of experience today is someone with superhuman strength when they're on angel dust or some other kind of hallucinogen. His life had become reduced to wandering day and night among the tombs, over the hills, alone, chased away by everyone who ever meant anything in his life, screaming and cutting himself with the stones. Don't miss that. He lived in the tombs. How out of control does your life have to be for your family and your friends to chase you out of your home, to drag you away from everything that you knew to be yours, and to just try to get rid of you by taking you to the cemetery and chaining you up and leaving you there probably to die? How bad must you hate your life that all that you can do is scream into the darkness and harm yourself by cutting yourself with the rocks, probably hoping to commit suicide? That's how bad his life had become. One of the members of 9 Inch Nails a few years ago, Trent Reznor, wrote a song called Hurt when he was struggling with his own addictions. And it really resonates with anyone who knows why all you can think of is to try to harm yourself. The lyrics go like this: I hurt myself today to see if I still feel. I focus on the pain. It's the only thing that's real. That's what this guy felt like. In verses 6 through 10, when he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him. And then he shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" Now I realize that's kind of a cleaned up video version of a Sunday morning reading of the text, when really it probably sounded something more like what Alfred Hitchcock or Stephen King should have recorded. He says, I'm begging you before God, don't torture me. He said this because Jesus had already told the evil spirit to come out of him. And then Jesus asked him, what is your name? And the man answered, my name's Legion, because there are many spirits within me. The spirits inside the man had begged Jesus again and again not to send them out of that area. Now, it may not mean a whole lot to us when he says, my name is Legion, but in that day you would understand that the Roman army was comprised of different legions, or regiments, if you will, and each one was made up of over 5,000 men. Now, before you get caught up in just how many individual demons that might represent, I think you can suffice it to understand that this guy was he was really messed up. He had more problems than anybody could keep track of. In John chapter 1, verses 4 and 5, it says, in him there was life, and that life was the light of all people. and the light shines in the darkness, but the darkness will not overpower it. And that's what this guy experienced when Jesus came into his life. In a world that was lived in the dark, in the tombs and the catacombs where the dead were laid to rest, Jesus brought light into his life. You see, life doesn't get much darker than screaming for death to take you at midnight in a cemetery. And that's what his life had become. In verses 11 through 14, it says in Mark 5 that nearby there were a large herd of pigs that were feeding on a hill. The demons begged Jesus, "Send us into the pigs. Let us go into them." So Jesus gave them permission. The evil spirits left the man and went into the pigs. There were about 2,000 of the pigs in the herd. The whole herd immediately rushed down the hill into the lake nearby and were drowned. Those who were tending the pigs ran off, and they went into town and the following countryside, and they told everyone what had happened. So the people went out to see for themselves, and when they came to Jesus, they saw this man who had been possessed by a legion of demons sitting there, dressed and in his right mind. You know, sometimes you read things in Scripture and you just have a thought pop into your head. Mine was this: where did he get the clothes? He'd already torn all of his clothes off. He'd already shredded them. The only possible solution is that Jesus or one of his followers probably took off his own cloak and wrapped him up in that tunic. There's an old hymn that still says it well. My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. When he shall come with trumpet sound, oh, may I then in him be found. Notice this next part: dressed in his righteousness alone, just like Legion. Dressed in his righteousness alone, faultless to stand before the throne. On Christ, the solid rock I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. What once belonged to Jesus now belongs to this man. The same guy who was once known for his inner demons that made him out of control is found sitting, thinking clearly, no longer raging, dressed and in the presence of Jesus, with nothing left but the scars of how he had hated his life previously. Verse 15 starts out with this: all of this made the people afraid. Those who had seen it told them what had happened to the man, and they told him about the pigs as well. And then the people began to beg Jesus to leave their area. Here's a life principle for you. People get scared by what they can't explain. And this certainly fell into that category. And a second life principle: when people are scared, they say and do the dumbest things. And that's certainly the case with these people, because the only thing they could think of, they couldn't explain what just happened, and so they just knew that Jesus was somehow the reason for it, and so they just decided to get rid of him. And you've got to go. You've got to go now. And so, verse 18 of Mark 5, as Jesus is getting back into the boat, the man who was freed from the demons begged to go with him. I understand that. I get that too. You've made a fool out of yourself in front of all of these people that you grew up with. They'd already made their choice a long time ago in his mind. They wanted nothing more to do with him. So why would he want to have anything to do with them? And yet, in the middle of this, it says that Jesus would not let him go. Instead, he said, go home to your family and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he's had mercy on you. Jesus is not afraid of the darkness in your life. Regardless of how out of control your life has become, Jesus has mercy. Regardless of how embarrassing you've been to your family, Jesus and his mercy can reunite you if you just own what you've done and what Jesus has made a difference in your life. And regardless of how many nights you've spent screaming into the darkness, wishing that you would die, and maybe even trying to help that happen, Jesus can restore a right mind within you. Just like Legion, we'd rather run away than start life over in the very place of our shame. We've been set free from the guilt of our past, but we're still wearing the rags of our shame. We'd rather start over where nobody knows our name, but Jesus knows our story, and He wants us to share how His story of mercy has become our story of hope. Shame argues that we're destined to be defined by our past demons, by our past failures, and by our ongoing guilt. But there's nothing that could be uncovered about us that isn't covered by the grace of Jesus Christ. As creepy as it could sound, it could also be liberating to ask ourselves periodically as we look in the mirror, what are you wearing? You don't have to keep wearing the guilt of your past. You don't have to keep wearing the rags of shame of what you've done and who you've become. You don't have to keep chaining yourself down with the fragments that Jesus has broken off. Instead, John would say it like this in 1 John 4, verse 9 and 10. God showed how much He loved us by sending His one and only Son into the world, so that we could have life through Him. This is real love. Not that we love God, but that He loved us, and He sent His Son as a sacrifice to take away our sin. You see, that's exactly what happened. He didn't just take away His chains. He didn't just take away the shackles. He didn't just take away the shame. He took away everything that robbed Him of life. In 2 Corinthians 5:21, Paul says it this way, God made Christ, who had never sinned, to become the offering for our sin, so that we could be made right with God through Christ. That's how you deal with guilt. That's how you deal with the embarrassment of your shame. For no matter what we've done, God has taken our guilt and our shame away from us, and instead of punishing us, He has chosen to punish Jesus, His Son, instead of me. Imagine what Jesus must think if I refuse to leave my past at the cross, where He sacrificed Himself in my place so I wouldn't have to be punished by God. Isn't it time that you stop letting yourself be defined by the guilt over your past? There's a Christian music artist named Lecrae, and he tells the following story about his own life as a boy growing up. He had a job at a grocery store. He was in charge of the carts, and as kids will do, he was messing around. Probably, if it were me, he'd be running, pushing the cart, jumping up onto it and riding. And, you get the long train of carts going. And he says, I was messing around one day and the carts flipped over. I tried to catch it, but in the meantime, it caught my finger. And in the process of everything else, it grabbed his little finger and ripped the fingernail out of his finger. Blood was spraying everywhere. He was freaking out. He'd never seen that much of his own blood. He goes running in the store, screaming for somebody to come help him. The butcher in the back comes out to the front of the store to see what all the commotion is. And when he sees what's going on, he takes a look at his finger and just the absence of a fingernail, and he holds up his own hand to Lecrae and says, "Don't worry, dude, you'll be okay." And he says, oddly enough, when he held up his own hand, it actually calmed me down, because it told me, if he can survive that, I can survive this. And that principle is still true. If we'll be honest about our scars, we can show other people that wounds can heal. In verse 20 of Mark 5, it says, So the man went away and began to tell the people in a region called the Decapolis, which meant 10 cities, how much Jesus had done for him, and all the people were amazed. There's an interesting follow-up to that. This account is in Mark chapter 5. It says he went back home to the region known as the Decapolis, the 10 cities. Just 3 chapters later, in Mark chapter 8, there's a crowd of over 4,000 men who had gathered to hear Jesus and his teaching. And like earlier with the feeding of the 5,000, they're hungry again. And so Jesus makes arrangements to feed them again. But what's intriguing about this is that these 4,000 men and everyone who was with them were in the region of the Decapolis, the very place where Legion had gone home to tell how much mercy Jesus had shown him and the difference he'd made in his life. Living in a place of the dead is no way to live unless it's the empty tomb of Jesus. Isn't it time that we tell the story of what God has done for us? Isn't it time we sing the praises of His mercy to us when we needed it most? Ironically, the saddest day on earth and the happiest day on earth were only 3 days apart. Maybe that same thing is true for you, that this may be the saddest moment, the saddest season in your life. Depression from the shame and the guilt may be weighing you down to the point where you think your life is over and there's nothing else for you to live for. But know this: the angel's message at the saddest moment in human history, when an innocent man was killed in the place of the guilty, the angel's message in Matthew 28, verse 6 was this: He isn't here. He's risen from the dead, just as He said it would happen. Come and see where His body was lying. God intends for us to live as though we believe Him. God intends for us to live forgiven. God intends for us to live as though we've been set free from everything that had been holding us back and holding us down, keeping us from the ones that we love the most. Everything that used to define us is nothing more than the phantom pain of an amputated limb. It may feel real, but there's nothing there. God has forgiven us in Christ. He offers that forgiveness to those who are one with Him, who have given up their own rags to be clothed with Christ. Our prayer is that you'll make that choice in your own life, to become one with Him, to be clothed in His righteousness, that you might stand before the throne on the solid ground of Jesus.